This is TWiT. So let's talk about Uber's new CEO, shall we?
Sure.
This was something we were actually last week, if you watched TWiT, we knew the board was meeting. We knew the candidates were Jeff Immelt, former CEO of GE, Meg Whitman, current CEO, right, of HP, former CEO of eBay.
Enterprise, I think.
HP Enterprise. Yeah. And a third, according to Kara Swisher, unnamed source. Well, guess who won? The third unnamed CEO, who turns out to be, I think by all accounts, exactly the right person for the job. His name is Dara Khosrowshahi. He was at Expedia, and if you read Ben Thompson's really excellent analysis on Stratechery, what he did at Expedia, which is essentially turn the company around from the ground up, not just adding a coat of paint on it, but really redesigning its business model. Do you have any experience of Dara? Do you know Dara, Phil?
I do know Dara, yeah. Not super well, but I've met him a few times.
What do you think?
I think he's great. I think he's a really good candidate. I'm hopeful that I think Uber is one of the most important companies in the world, and I'm hoping that this means that things turn around for them. We also know Travis, so
yeah.
In all fairness, I know both of them.
Yeah. And of course, there's a lawsuit still going on, and there's all. I mean, it's still kind of a mess.
Yeah.
Some people were blaming the board at Uber. Now you've dealt with a board. Tell us first of all a little bit about the responsibility of a board of directors for a company, not a public company, but a soon-to-be public company like Uber, and certainly a unicorn like Uber. What is their job?
The responsibility doesn't really change that much if you're private or public. It's
okay.
To oversee the governance of the company, to make sure that
you boss the boss.
You decide who the boss should be.
Yeah.
I think ultimately the only real job of the board is to figure out who's running the company. Everything else is sort of...
You advise the CEO?
That's sort of a secondary thing. So I think the first thing is you decide who the CEO should be, and then, as a secondary thing, you advise to the extent that's necessary.
You don't control. One of the things Khosrowshahi did apparently in his deck that he presented the board with was said, "Don't call me, I'll call you." The sense I got was, don't tell me what to do. If I need your advice, I'll ask.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's good general CEO advice. You should keep your board busy. You should give them work to do. If you don't keep your board busy, they will try to figure out how to be helpful.
It's a tough board because you have you've got some big institutional investors like Benchmark. You've got some kind of activist investors, right? Who are kind of Benchmark said Travis has got to go for one thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get in the middle of any of that. I know most of the people involved, and they're for the most part all good people. It's a super complicated company. I mean, one thing we should point out is like the Uber situation right now is probably the most Game of Thrones like board dynamic that exists.
There you go.
It's like this is not like what normal boards or companies are like. No, not at all. But like Uber is a fundamentally important company.
So you said a couple of things, and so why is Uber a fundamentally important company? It's just a ride-sharing company. It's a replacement for taxis. What makes it so important?
I think it ushered in, to a large extent, the gig economy, which is probably the most important economic force for the next couple of decades. I think it's more influential to changing what the idea of car ownership should be than even Tesla. I basically think like the two most important companies in the world right now are Amazon and Uber in terms of their ability to like influence the lives of billions of people. If for good or bad, and I think more on balance good, but I'm an optimist.
So, all right, if it's that important and it's that challenging, if it's a Game of Thrones board, what does Dara need to do as he moves into leadership there?
Just run the business. I mean, I'm not going to give Dara advice. That's
focus on the business.
Yeah, focus on the business. Focus. Make sure that the
should he replace
the ethics
the board?
Are real.
Does he need to bring in a new board?
Well, that's not usually up to the CEO. That's up to the shareholders elect the board.
But he could go to the shareholders and say
he could. I think you should probably get that figured out before he accepts. Just to sort of Uber needs to minimize drama for the next couple of years, if at all possible.
Supposedly that was.
I have to give you a little bit of pushback on that. Like what Susan Fowler wrote about wasn't drama, and she really brought some extremely concerning allegations forward about that culture. And I just don't want us to roller skate past that. And she is women in tech have groups where women in tech talk honestly about what companies to go to and what companies to avoid. And from everything I personally have heard, Uber is a fundamentally, I'm trying to think of the right word, a fundamentally damaged place for women to go work. And I feel like I need to say that. But, you know, the gender issue aside and the employment issue aside, to me, I think Uber's longest term challenge is the fact that, you know, riders only pay for a fraction of what a rideshare actually costs. And the rest of it is, you know, venture capital. I'm very much for this model. I think it's much more convenient for consumer, but I don't see how it's sustainable, you know, 10 years from now. I don't know how you like recoup these costs enough, even if you go to an automatic, you know, AI model for driving.
Yeah, and I don't want to. When I say that I think Uber is one of the most important companies in the world, I don't at all mean that it's a very good company. That's a different thing to say. And there's been tremendous problems at Uber that I think are very serious. I know a lot of people there at every level, and it is both a great place and in many ways a terrible place, and it's done terrible things.
It's not merely the sexism; it's also the God mode. Some of the illegalities. They're now being accused of bribing officials in other countries. There's a violation of U.S. law. I mean, there's a lot of problems.
There's a lot of problems. It's a difficult culture. Dara really needs to, as much as possible, shine as much sunlight as possible onto it, get it all out in the open.
But that's what you mean by get rid of the drama, which is...
Yeah, I'm not trying to paper over it at all. There's fundamental issues that need to be tackled.
Yeah.
But I think that's worth tackling. The question is, like, is Uber worth saving? And I think it absolutely is. But it's a difficult job to do it.
So if we just look at I mean, if we backseat all those other issues, which are not insignificant and enough to bring a better company to its knees, there is, it strikes me, a fundamental financial challenge, which is Uber lost $3 billion last year. It's on track to lose the same amount this year. That's a lot of money to lose. They, in order to become profitable, need to somehow make more money on the rides. One thought, when you mentioned it, of course, Brianna, is replace the drivers with automated vehicles, but that seems to me a long way off. How much runway does a company like Uber have? And can it go back to its investors who have now valued it at $70 billion and say, hey, we'd like to be worth a little more? Can they get more money out of these guys?
Well, they don't need to be worth more to get more money.
Okay, but they need to get more money, right?
They'll need to get more money, yeah.
They don't have enough. I don't know what their runway is, but it can't be more than a few years. We're more than a few years off from self-driving, from driverless vehicles.
I don't think they're looking necessarily for self-driving to be the only way they become self-sustainable.
What else can they do?
I mean, look, when Uber was getting started, I remember the early investor meetings, and I remember investors saying, well, yeah, like, okay, so let's say they become the world's largest, taxi company, and they own 10% of the taxi market. Well, what would it be worth?
Not $70 billion, I'm guessing.
But I also remember Travis saying, we're not going to own 10% of the taxi market. We're going to own 10,000% of the taxi market.
Oh, interesting.
And that's
we're going to replace car ownership with, and we were just talking about that. It's cheaper to go buy Uber than to have a car. On the other hand, that's because Uber subsidizes 59% of the ride.
Right. So the question is, how long are investors willing to subsidize it?
Right.
And that's based entirely on how good is their story for long-term fundamental profitability. And I don't know. I haven't seen the decks.
Well, the other question is, how much are consumers willing to pay to ride Uber? So I take Uber to places that I would never have taken a taxi. Yeah. It's like $125 to take a taxi from my house to SFO. I wouldn't do it. But I'll take an Uber for $30-40.
I would not be living in San Francisco if it wasn't for Uber.
Right. But what if Uber had
you can say thank you, Uber, for giving all of us a $3 billion subsidy.
Right, that's the problem.
That's not a business.
What if
we love them.
What if my trip to the airport became $75 and now I'm going to be taking Super Shuttle instead? Or
it's not a business.
Drive me?
It is a business. It's infrastructure, right? It's in the same way that like airports don't get paid off in the first 2 or 3 years, and neither do like highways, and neither do high-speed rails, and neither will Hyperloop One, and neither will SpaceX. Like Uber and Lyft and others are making fundamental infrastructure, and the payback period on those is long.
So wait a minute, the infrastructure as opposed to paying the drivers? I mean, airports are huge, right? There's a lot of concrete that goes into airports and land.
On-demand, like cars as a service, is fundamental infrastructure.
But Uber doesn't own the
exceptional infrastructure.
Uber doesn't, right now, under the current model with drivers, Uber doesn't own the cars. The drivers own the cars.
The concept of ownership, I think, is also, like companies, increasingly archaic and gets sliced and diced in different ways.
So what's the path to profit? It's a vastly increased market, basically.
It's a big market.
You're going to make it up in volume.
Lose about money on every sale and make it up in volume.
I mean, it's charging people slightly more than it costs to sell your product. The question is when.
That's a lot more.
That's the question. And will people pay slightly more than it costs to sell the product?
And I'm not saying that Uber stock is a good buy at this point. I'm not saying that it's not. That's like I honestly don't know.
It has, according to the New York Times, $6.6 billion in cash. At the run rate right now, that's a couple of years, maybe 3 years. That's the runway. That's a pretty quick turnaround unless they get more cash. And already many investors are saying it's not worth what they paid for it.
And how's Lyft doing? Does anybody have the data on Lyft?
Well, Lyft seems to be fumbling a massively great opportunity. I don't know why Lyft isn't jumping on this one all over the place. But go ahead. I'm sorry, Brianna. I cut you off.
No. I was just going to say, I had a meeting today. Boston has some of the worst public transportation systems in the United States. The
Better than San Francisco.
Laughing stock. And San Francisco, which is doing the same thing I'm about to say, which is working with partners like Uber and Lyft to subsidize the fact that we can't build our own infrastructure there. So maybe long term, the Department of Transportation pays X number of dollars to keep, Amtrak running and the T running, maybe the answer there is there's a public component going to these private companies. I think that's easily arguable. But, the fact is, I travel all over this country because I speak a lot. And, what I hear, if you want to know what an area is going through, you talk to the Uber drivers out there because they're the ones trying to make a living doing it. And, what I hear from people is they're already not really making enough to make that job worth it. And, I suspect that as they're trying to recoup these losses, it is going to come at the expense of their workforce. And that really concerns me.